Hello and welcome to another Times Radio Frontline recap. Now, we've got some good videos for this week, but the clips that we're going to show on here, as ever, please go and watch all the videos that we put out because they're all fantastic. Some really good interviews this week. I'm Ingram. I present Times Radio Frontline, but I also comment on all matters geopolitics, defence, security, counterterrorism, cyber, and anything else that people ask me to around the world. So what are we going to look at this week? Well, first of all, let's look at what's influencing the geopolitical situation. Here's Vladimir Putin talking about Pokrovsk being surrounded and his new nuclear-powered missile and his new nuclear torpedo.
The overall situation in the Special Military Operations Zone is developing favourably for us. Your comrades are advancing and actively operating in all areas. In two places, as you know, we have already publicly stated this. In Kupiansk and Pokrovsk, the enemy has been blocked and surrounded. By the way, I discussed this issue with the comrades of the relevant forces. They are not opposed to allowing media representatives, foreign and Ukrainian journalists, into the enemy encirclement zones so that they can go in and see for themselves what's happening, verify the state of the encircled Ukrainian forces, and also so that Ukraine's political leadership can make an appropriate decision regarding the fate of its citizens and servicemen, as they once did in Azovstal. What you're doing, what your comrades, your soldiers and officers are doing, is the most important task the country is currently undertaking, ensuring its security and the security of our people for the long term. But no less important is that while we address these critical current issues, we're not forgetting about improving and strengthening our strategic potential. You've probably heard that a new unlimited-range nuclear-powered missile was recently tested. It has undeniable advantages. We can be proud of the achievements of our scientists, specialists and engineers. The advantage is that this small nuclear propulsion system, while comparable in power to, say, a nuclear submarine's nuclear reactor, is 1,000 times smaller than a submarine's nuclear reactor. 1,000 times! But that's not even the most important thing. The most important thing is that while a conventional nuclear reactor starts up in hours, days and weeks, this nuclear reactor starts up in minutes and seconds. That's a huge achievement. But we'll also be able to apply this to the national economy in the future, to address energy supply issues in the Arctic and to the nuclear lunar program. Even now, the radiation-hardened electronics used in the missile are already being used in space programs. So this is a breakthrough not only in enhancing the country's defense capability, but also in science and the national economy in general. But that's not all. You should know, yesterday we conducted another test of our promising missile system. This is the Poseidon unmanned underwater vehicle, also with a nuclear propulsion system. For the first time, we succeeded not only in launching it from a submarine using its booster motor, but also in igniting the nuclear propulsion system, which in the vehicle used for a certain period of time. This is a tremendous success. The Poseidon's power significantly exceeds that of even our most advanced intercontinental range missile, the Sarmat. There's no missile like the Sarmat in the world. It's not yet deployed in Russia, but it will be soon. But the Poseidon is significantly more powerful than the Sarmat. Furthermore, the speed and depth of this unmanned vehicle are unmatched in the world, and it's unlikely to be developed anytime soon, and there are no existing interception methods.
So, Pokrovsk being surrounded, Vladimir Putin's been saying this for quite some time. The Russians for the last 18 months have been creating a cauldron around the outside of Pokrovsk, and Putin is trying to suggest that the tops of the cauldron are closing in and isolating the Ukrainian troops. It's been closing in and isolating the Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk for almost a year, that 18 months. And I think looking at some of the maps that Putin has been putting out or that have been seen behind his briefing team and the reality of what's going on the ground, the Russians are advancing slowly and are squeezing the Ukrainians even more, but they're not just about to close Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians may be about to make a decision to withdraw from Pokrovsk to their next defensive lines again, and if they do, that will be a deliberate military operation because it's not worth them suffering the casualties to keep the troops resupplied and to rotate the troops and everything else. But that would be a deliberate move. The Russians are not advancing fast. This is not the indication of a collapse of Ukrainian defense or Russian offense. And the cost that there's been to Vladimir Putin and his troops is phenomenal. 1,000 troops a day, dead or wounded, and not available to fight elsewhere. And of course, then we get into Putin saying that his nuclear-powered missile is unstoppable and his nuclear torpedo is unstoppable. That's Putin getting his nuclear willy out again and waving it. Let's see what Donald Trump has to say about that.
It had to do with others. They seem to all be nuclear testing. Russia? We have more nuclear weapons than anybody. We don't do testing. We've halted it many years ago. But with others doing testing, I think it's appropriate that we do also.
Any details around the testing, sir? Like where, when?
It'll be announced. We have test sites. It'll be announced.
And here, this is Donald Trump talking about the US restarting nuclear testing after Russia's Skyfall test. And the Skyfall is the Western description for the Russian nuclear-powered cruise missile. And again, responding to Vladimir Putin getting his nuclear willy out, Donald Trump is willy waving as well to see, and we've got this game of mine is bigger than yours. If it wasn't so pathetic and it wasn't between two huge nuclear powers, then I'd describe it as sad. I describe it as worrying. When we get nuclear powers at this level being so flippant about the use of nuclear weapons, then it is shocking. Donald Trump hasn't clarified what he means by nuclear testing, whether that's just the missile testing, i.e. the delivery mechanism testing, or whether it is testing warheads. That would be significant. And of course, he was talking about it in the context of China as well, because China is increasing its nuclear arsenal enormously. We're in a new nuclear arms race. Vladimir Putin's nuclear-powered missile and his nuclear torpedo, they're fantasy weapons. They provide no additional capability over and above what the Russians have got already with their intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are much more capable. So again, this is information domain. It's trying to worry people, trying to scare people. Should we be scared? Yes, because two major leaders with huge nuclear arsenals are talking about nuclear weapons. But in reality, I don't think we're any closer to there being nuclear exchange or nuclear war, because both leaders realised just what would happen if that came in. But it's worrying to hear this rhetoric being normalised. And of course, this is something that in our first interview that I'm going to point you towards today with Matthew Saville, Matthew is talking about the new Skyfall missile.
Yeah, I'm going to use the NATO designation for the missile because it's easier to pronounce. It's the Skyfall. This is one of these kind of wonder weapons that sits in the category particularly of prestige nuclear or nuclear capable weapons that the Russians have been developing for some years to go on alongside sort of very long range torpedoes that have got nuclear warheads and other things. And I should start by saying there is a lot of skepticism within particularly the expert missile community over the genuine utility of these weapons, in particular in terms of the cost of development. Skyfall is a cruise missile, but the key difference is that it is nuclear powered. It has a nuclear reactor on board, and then an engineer could explain this better than I, a form of intake. It's air breathing, but it essentially is then able to use the reactor to, I think it's heat the air, but essentially provide propulsion. So it's not burning fuel. It's launched assisted by conventionally, but it isn't. It is then, in theory, has infinite range. As long as the reactor is functioning, it can propel itself. The reason that is problematic, it means you can fire it, launch it, and it can loiter around for an incredibly long period of time. You can send it off on very, tangential directions. If you have a problem with a country's air defences, you launch it off at a completely different angle and it circles round, and then several hours later it comes back and strikes from a completely different direction. So this sounds worrying. The issue, though, and the reason why the missile skeptics will kind of point out flaws is, first of all, you don't need unlimited range with the kind of ballistic missiles that the Russians have and some of their other high-speed cruise missiles, including air-launched ones of various types, all of which have nuclear options on them. So if you've got a ballistic missile, an intermediate-range ballistic missile of several thousand kilometres, you can hit all of Europe. And they've got submarine-launched ballistic missiles that can obviously hit the US. If you have air-launched cruise missiles, which the Russians have, some of which have ranges of hundreds of kilometres, some of which have a couple of thousand. Well, then the UK is in range, and why do you need an infinite ranged, quite complicated missile that might be spewing radioactive air out? And then finally, there is the question of, do you need this purely for nuclear delivery, in which case you have these other tried and tested systems, or conventional delivery? But if you're going to drop a nuclear reactor on someone's country and scatter radiological material all over the place, so it'd be like a dirty bomb. We're not talking about like a nuclear reaction and a nuclear explosion, but if I have a conventional warhead of several £100 and I fire that at somebody and it happens to have a nuclear reactor glued on the back, a load of radioactive material is going to be spread everywhere. Well, what's the reaction going to be? That could be quite unpredictable. It suddenly becomes a weapon that, if you're using it, what are the circumstances under which you're using it? So that is not to completely gainsay that this thing has any utility, but it feels to some, I'm still to make up my mind, a little bit like a vanity project. So anyway, that is the Skyfall missile. That's what it does, explained in very simplistic terms. And I think, in truth, the bigger concern is Russia's large and expanding arsenal of high-speed ballistic and cruise missiles.
And Matthew, quite clearly highlights the nuclear-powered capability of the Skyfall missile, a ramjet where the air is compressed in the ramjet and then heated by this nuclear reactor strapped on the back of the missile, and highlights the fact that it has to be a missile with a nuclear warhead, otherwise you're creating a dirty bomb. And he questions the utility of it because, as I've questioned, it's something that will send a very large nuclear arrow pointing at this is where the missile is, and a big beacon flashing on the back of it to satellites in space from this nuclear reactor that is powering the ramjet, that this is where I am. It may be able to stay in the air for a long period of time. It may be able to fly around. It'll worry people if it's launched, but that will give countries an awful lot more time to put defences in place to be able to take it out of the sky if it is then sent off to attack a target. Of course, if it's taken out of the sky, you've then got a radiological problem because that little nuclear reactor, that clearly is not well encased, because it couldn't be because of the weight requirements that you'd have to have around it. And potentially a nuclear warhead somewhere will be contaminating the environment, and it's something that has to be taken into account. Watch the whole of Matthew's interview. Matthew always gives fantastic insights. The next two videos I'm going to point you at are my interview with Orysia Lutsevich. And Orysia is talking about the Russian economy and the oil trouble. And Orysia is from Chatham House. Have a listen here. Now, if we look at it now then into what's happening in Russia, the Russian newspapers are becoming increasingly bold in their comments against what is happening to the Russian economy, against the control that the government is showing. We had Vladimir Putin yesterday sitting talking to many of his leaders and trying to give them a degree of confidence. I don't think there was anything of substance came out from what he said. But do you think that the pressure that Ukraine is putting on Russia by attacking the oil infrastructure and its ability to continue to fund the war, combined with the pressure that's coming from the US and other countries' sanctions against your large Russian oil and gas companies, and we're seeing that reflected into the shadow fleets and everything else, do you think that's going to have a negative effect on Putin? Do you think he's worried?
Yes, absolutely. I think so far Putin's special operation around Trump to basically get him on his side vis-a-vis his agenda, how the war should end in Ukraine, is failing, because Trump understood many things, and the most important thing he understood is that Europe is not abandoning Ukraine. So that we can, like we've discussed before. Now, the fact that there are three factors. One is that there are new sanctions on large Russian oil companies. means that 80% of Russian oil export is now impacted, and it's toxic for Chinese companies who are very cautious of trading with these companies and Indian companies. So that is the new contingency that Russia has to deal with. Second, it's Ukrainian direct attacks on oil refineries and destroying equipment that Russia cannot get so easily to replace because of the sanction regime again. And it has attacked, I believe, 22 out of 38 large refineries. So the scale of it is quite large. And the fact that pressures are piling up on the Russian budget, where, the interest rates are high, the industry is complaining that they cannot refinance their debt, that they are also struggling to get enough people to produce, and also the demand, even for, if you take a basic metrics, which is the Lada with the Russian, car, the production is dropping for the first time in decades because the Russians are not buying it. So but beyond this, the monetary impact, the budget impact, the fact that Russian economy relies for rent payments and internal corruption that comes a lot from oil and gas industry will have an impact on stability of the system. Because Russian economy, in a way, is pre-modern. It's not so diversified. It's the scale of production of processed materials or machinery it sells raw materials, to the world, to China, India, Africa. So it will struggle to maintain regime stability, and this is very important because many people should understand that this is the only calculus that matters for Putin and for people around him, whether Russia is able to wage war and remain stable.
Now, Arisia is highlighting the fact that the Russian economy is in this dilemma position where Putin's economy is based on a wartime economy. However, the impact that there is on his ability to continue to fund that wartime economy because of the Ukrainian successful attacks on oil and gas refining capability and storage capability, combined with the sanctions that are coming from the United States and the impact that that's having on China, India, and Greece's decisions to, and this is Greek shipping companies' decisions to continue to transport or buy Russian oil or oil and gas products is significant. And she describes very eloquently how Putin is in a real dilemma position now. He can't afford the war to continue, but he can't afford the war not to continue. And that is a very interesting position. She goes on to describe, and if you watch the full interview, about how Ukraine is in a position, and there may be discussion out there to suggest that Ukraine is suffering from manpower and suffering shortage of cash. She says that doesn't really matter. Ukraine is not going to give up until Ukraine wins its territory back again. Now, Arisia is Ukrainian, but actually, listen to her analysis, I agree with it completely. And then the final clip for you to look at is, again, another interview I did with Major General Chip Chapman. Chip and I have worked together on operations before on many occasions, and Chip is talking about how long Moscow will be able to continue to support Putin's war.
We would have an understanding of the Ukrainian position because of the sort of targeting information and the sort of capabilities that we give them. But we're never really sure, I think, of where we are on this. There's kind of two triangles, I think, which are important at the moment. The first one is where we are and what the shape is on the reward, pressure, concessions triangle. And the second one is the one really with the Clausewitzian trinity about can we remove one of the three pillars from Putin of either elite defection or the military saying enough is enough, or the population saying enough is enough. Now, again, I liked a phrase over a year ago from the head of MI6, Sir Richard Moore, that's saying a tight grip is not the same as a stable grip. And so knowing when these sort of elements may come to a tilt point is very, very difficult to do, because you can analyze the metrics as much as you like, but knowing when that tilt point is going to come is incredibly difficult to do. That's the same for the Russians in terms of the Ukrainian position. And I guess if you were looking for a historical analogy, one which would fit about someone who seems to have so much power against someone who's a lot weaker, you would look at something like Rolling Thunder for a contemporary example, the strategic bombing campaign of the Americans in Vietnam from March 65 to sort of October 68, which had no strategic effects. That is, so the Russians from day one were able to make sure there was no sanctuary for the Ukrainians in any part of Ukraine because of their capabilities, their ballistic and cruise missiles. Ukraine didn't have that capability, but they have it now, or are gaining that capability now. We just don't know if that will provide the lever which does bring Putin to his senses. What I think we are seeing is more and more voices within inside Russia, including in the military and the informed commentators in Russia, that the war has probably reached a strategic and political dead end. And this doesn't look like a special military operation. It absolutely looks something like war, and something like war which is affecting the people. So there are these stresses, I think, for Putin, but whether they'll be decisive in bringing him to negotiations in the way that Putin would probably argue that the stresses which they've had on the Ukrainian economy, infrastructure, population throughout the depth of Ukraine for the last nearly barreling on to nearly 4 years now, he might have thought that they would go under. Because, of course, the thing you can't measure, or is very difficult to measure in war, is the will of the people, the military, and all those things.
But it's that will of the people that is critical to Putin, I think, because that's the one thing he fears. He can keep throwing more personnel at the meat grinder operation. He can still keep believing he can win things from a tactical perspective. But Zelensky has ordered an expansion of strikes deeper into Russia, and he's put a good information operation, information campaign out about this in the last couple of days, specifically noting Russian oil refining is already paying a tangible price, and we're seeing that reflected in the responses to the additional American sanctions against the export of oil. China reducing its purchase of it, India doing the same, Greek shipping companies turning around saying they're not going to ship it anymore because they're scared of American sanctions. And then the Russian newspapers themselves are talking about the decline of the industrial base that there is through Russia and employment. And this is hitting that fear point that Putin has of creating the conditions for the people to step up and rally against him. Do you think it's a genuine fear? And of course, we've seen massive air defense capabilities moved in around the Kremlin over the last 48, 72 hours, taking them away from oil refineries and other potential priority targets, which the Ukrainians, I think, will exploit the opportunities that are given there. Do you think this is an indication of Putin's just not happy about things, or is it a green shoot of failure beginning to come to the Russians?
I think it should be a fear for him. I think it's particularly salient that, as you said, they're taking more air defense assets away to make sure that Moscow and other key points are protected. But that does lead to gaps, which it's the gaps and surfaces which the Ukrainian long-range strikes can exploit. Again, I think there are too many variables, because we know that war is the most complex activity that you can partake in. And again, the other one which I kind of remember in this sort of sphere is when Prigozhin sort of said prior to Bakhmut, and Bakhmut is now a long time ago, a lot of commentators at the time saying that Bakhmut would be strategic defeat. It was nonsense, always was nonsense. But at the time, he said that the Russians must be prepared to live like North Korea for 5 years. Now, that's a key determinant in the populace. Are they prepared to live like North Korea for 5 years? Now, in a digitally authoritarian society, which has been going that way and for the last 25 years under Putin, we really just don't know. You and I don't know the answer to that question. You would hope our intelligence agencies would have slightly more human, so that they would have a good go at that question. But that, to me, is one of the key variables. And I do remember when I was doing this stuff for real in 2011, after the Arab Spring, when every metric that you could look at in terms of Syria indicated that that regime would collapse imminently, 1 month, 2 months. It held on for another 13 years under Assad. So that is the real reason why this is really difficult to understand. And the variable from both sides is, of course, that we don't ultimately know how much support will be given to Russia by North Korea, by Iran, by China, and of course, ultimately, how much support will be given to Ukraine, not from the European side, some of that being peeled off at the moment slightly, but Europe plus America. And those are all big variables, both in terms of military capability and military sustainability, alongside the humanitarian aid and financial aid that Ukraine needs.
Now, what Chip is saying is a lot of things from a military perspective that Orisia has said from a geopolitical analysis perspective, and again highlights the fact that Putin can't afford to continue with the war, but can't afford the war not to continue, and the difficulties that Putin is having in mobilizing his troops, in continuing with his defence industrial base, continuing to provide the resources that are needed to support the conflict. And again, Chip highlights here the fact that the difference between the tactical fight and the effective stalemate that there is on the front line in the east, compared with the operational level fight that is influencing what's going on strategically from Russia, but also Russia's ability to continue to support its tactical battle. Chip always gives some amazing insights and puts them into a very good historical context, so go and watch the whole of the video. So that's all I've got for you this week. Please sign up for Times Radio membership, and that'll give you exclusive access to our content early, but also give you the ability to put your points and put your questions for me to answer in a Q&A. And if there's any points that you particularly want dealt with, please highlight those. But thank you for watching. Goodbye.